Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit, and welcome to my after-hour lounge. Today, we're going to kick back in a nice big velvet chair with a lovely tall glass of ICEY. Haven't done one of these episodes in a little while. That's dumb. I should be doing way more of these. This is a show where I like to highlight something that I found that I think is really cool. It's usually after about an hour or so of playing. It's usually a game that's given me a really good first impression, something that really makes me want to play more. ICEY might be one of the biggest examples of this. This game came out of absolutely nowhere. It is developed by a small Chinese developer who claimed to have spent about a decade developing this thing in various forms. And you're looking at it initially and you might be thinking, alright, 2D side-scrolling brawler. Pretty stylish, pretty damn cool, but nothing special. Could not be further from the truth. The Shanghai FantaBlade network responsible for creating this has made something that is not only an exceptionally good side-scrolling brawler, but it's also a game within a game. It's a game that fundamentally messes with your mind. It's a game that is deliberately designed to screw with you. It's got a huge meta-narrative aspect to it. This is essentially what would happen if you took Bayonetta, made it 2D, and then mashed it up with the Stanley Parable. You might be thinking, how on earth is that even possible? The Stanley Parable was basically a walking simulator, right? Yeah, it was. And quite a few games that have focused on this idea of meta-narrative, the notion of self-awareness, the notion that they know it's a game, and they play with the fact that you are a player. You are not the character, you are role-playing the character. You are controlling the character, but you are not the character. This game goes one step even further when it comes to dealing with that direction, because not only does it deal with you, the player, but it also deals with the character and the whole notion of the character's sense of free will and her impetuousness, her desire perhaps to ignore instructions or follow them one way or the other. And the way that it does that is by having a narrator. I think that's not too unusual. I've seen quite a few games with narrators. In this case, of course, the game is narrated in Chinese with a set of subtitles down the bottom so that you are well aware of what's being said. Very well written as well, I might add. I don't know how accurate the translation is exactly, but even if it's not, it's certainly accurate enough to get the point across. I haven't noticed a single weird bit of translation in there at all. In fact, the writing is very good, and it's quite important to do that because you need to convey nuance. You need to be able to convey humor. You've got to be able to convey the subtleties when you're going to make a game that is about messing with the player. Now, the way that it fundamentally messes with the player is really quite a simple concept. The game asks you to follow an arrow. And if you don't do that, then various things will happen. It will generally acknowledge that you haven't done that. If you think of the way that Bastion did its narration, for instance, and to some degree Transistor as well, Bastion would have narration lines for unusual situations. The designers would sort of have to predict player unpredictability. The irony, of course, of predicting player unpredictability is that, in fact, it's not unpredictability at all. It was successfully predicted. And that's something that's done a lot here. In fact, there's a much bigger focus on that in ICEY than even perhaps games like Stanley Parable. You might be thinking, looking at this footage, that can't be true. I mean, I'm just fighting a boss. Yeah, you're totally right. I'm having to be very careful in this video not to show too much of the narration because there are spoilers at every possible turn, but I'm going to include something very special after the end screen of this video that is something of a minor spoiler. It's the developer directly talking to the player about the development of the game, and yet still also talking to the character. So if you don't want to see that, if you'd rather discover it on your own, then by all means, please do tune out after the end of this video during the end slate, during the sort of end screen of it, because otherwise you will be spoiled. But as I said before, it really is about following an arrow. You are tasked with taking somebody out. You're a sort of cyborg whose role as far as we know anyway, is to take out a particular character. We know where that character is, just have to follow the arrow to get there. But the game asks you a very simple question. Why do you believe the narrator? Who the hell is the narrator to be telling you what to do? Who's making this arrow? How accurate is it? How do we know that this isn't leading us into a trap? It asks us a few fundamental questions about just how blindly we often do exactly what a game tells us to do. We unthinkingly obey without question, and that's a big theme with this particular game. The thing which makes it stand out is that it's not the only game to have done something like that. As I said before, Stanley Parable, and there are definitely other titles that have elements to that, greater or lesser extent. And yet, with this game, you have really strong actual gameplay elements in it as well. You could take the meta aspect away from this game entirely, and you would still have an extremely competent side-scrolling brawler. When it comes to the mechanics of this game, it's very, very strong. It's incredibly responsive. There are a huge amount of different moves and combos that you can learn, not to mention the fact that you can upgrade those as well, which allows you to make them more powerful and lets you focus on particular fighting styles. You do only have one weapon, but there are a massive number of different moves that you can learn with it. As you've probably seen on the screen, there are particular kill moves as well, which allow you to regenerate your shield somewhat. The game doesn't have a block, but it does allow you to dash, which gives you some invincibility frames. And you also have a shield, and while that shield is active, your combos will not be interrupted. It also combines it with a lovely little element of slowdown, which results in some of the attacks feeling particularly crushing. I've discussed this in previous videos. Quite a lot of players will be able to identify good elements of combat systems that allow for attacks to feel powerful, but they can't necessarily identify why. And quite a few developers use these temporary interruptions as punctuation. You'll probably recognize that idea from games like God of War. God of War does it a lot, Bayonetta does it quite a bit. A lot of these big character action or spectacle fighter games do it. And the whole point is to emphasize that what you just did hurts like a bastard. And it works very, very well, as long as you don't overdo it, because then it can become somewhat annoying. This game does it just enough, and the kill move aspect looks great. A lot of the combo finishers look great. Once you reach the end of a combo, that final crashing move will smash into the ground, slow everything down, throw out some particle effects, and show a very obvious amount of damage on the opponent. It's really nicely animated. It's surprisingly well animated for what's essentially an indie game. You could argue that it's not, because there is a publisher for it, but developed by a very, very small team indeed. Very, very well animated. Not necessarily a game that has a huge number of frames of animation, hugely detailed animation, but very effective animation. Animation which effectively conveys the speed, the power, and the elegance of the combat system. And as I said, you could very easily just release a game that did that, and that would be totally fine, and it would be a good game. It would be a game that I enjoyed. It would basically be Phantom Breaker. Well, it's a game that I looked at quite some time ago and said, you know what? Great side-scrolling brawler. I have an affinity for side-scrolling brawlers. I've liked them for a very long time. I recall the days of playing Golden Axe and Streets of Rage with my next-door neighbor on their Sega Mega Drive, and I enjoyed those games very much. And it's a genre that's getting a little bit of a resurgence at the moment, and I'm very happy to see that. And it's also, of course, being combined with different elements. One of my favorite games of all time, Guardian Heroes, combined that particular genre with RPGs, allowing for multi-level choice, allowing you to experience different paths, but also allowing you to level up statistics for your character. Thought that was really great. In this case, what we've got is a really slick side-scrolling brawler combined with a game that is almost too clever for its own good, really focusing on that idea of meta-narrative. It's so hard to explain that without spoiling anything. It makes videos like this a little bit tricky, but you're just gonna have to trust me when I say that the game is chock full of some weird stuff. Even the death screen is mocking you. The game, for instance, very, very early on, quote, reboots. You seem to be within some sort of weird operating system, running some strange program. Are you, aren't you? Is it just something that the game is doing to mess around? It's a stylistic choice. It reminds me somewhat of Superhot from earlier in the year that was doing some similar things. And I would imagine that there may have been a degree of inspiration there, but who knows? And this game has been in development for such a goddamn long time. It's very difficult to truly know what the influences are. One of the things that I really enjoy about this game is trying to outsmart the developer, bearing in mind the developers pretty clearly thought very long and hard about the average player's disobedience. And more often than not, I find that the developer has outsmarted me, not the other way around. And that is a very joyful feeling indeed. He has spent a great deal of time thinking about exactly what a disobedient player might do, where they may decide to go against the grain, which commands they may decide to disobey, which areas they may decide to go into, and what actions they may decide to take that are not necessarily disobedient, but the kind of thing that verges on emergent gameplay. And yet the crazy thing about that is that it's only the illusion of emergent gameplay. The developer already accounted for it, and it's joyous to actually see that. You think you've done something really smart and clever, something that the game wasn't designed for, but then there's a line of narration that very clearly says, yeah, I anticipated that you'd do that. I knew you could do that. I view single-player games as competitive, because I view that as the notion of competing with the developer's challenges, the things that the developer had prepared for me. And regardless of the fact that it isn't a multiplayer game, I still view that as competition. In this case, it's not only competition against a fairly damn difficult game, honestly. It's very easy to screw up in this game. The boss fights are certainly very, very challenging indeed. But you're also competing with the developer's design. You're competing with the developer's intelligence and the developer's little mental traps that he set around the place. You're trying to outsmart him. You're trying to figure out something that the developer hasn't already planned for. And most of the time you fail. It's this wonderful intellectual duel, I suppose. I'm going to sound fedora as hell saying this, but it reminds me a little bit of anime like Death Note or Code Geass. Is it Code Geass? Is that how you pronounce it? It's probably Yeast or something along those lines. Anyway, both of those shows focus for the most part on two characters who are obviously very intelligent, trying to outsmart each other. Plans within plans within plans. A lot of forward thinking and all that sort of thing, which makes those shows intriguing, which makes those shows incredibly tense. This game's got an element of that to it. And I love that about it. But it takes a very special game to be able to stand on the merits of several different separate parts of it. You'll hear me say every now and again that this is a game that stands on the merits of its combat system or its narrative, its soundtrack, its aesthetic, its graphical prowess, even its technical prowess, is how good of a PC version it is, or the technology that it has on display. It's pretty damn rare to find a game that can stand on the merits of more than one element. If one of these elements was taken away, the game would still be a very strong title. And I think ICEY is that. Its combat is gloriously enjoyable for somebody like me that really loves brawlers. Its meta-narrative aspect is phenomenal. Its OST is great. Its aesthetic is fantastic. It's just such a wonderful achievement, and ridiculously cheap for what it is as well. I mean, this is a $10 single-player title that takes so many risks, that does so many brave things, and accomplishes pretty much all of them, and comes from a place where you wouldn't necessarily expect a game like that to come from. That sounds somewhat ignorant on my part. I have to admit that I'm not the most knowledgeable when it comes to Chinese game development, and there are a lot of unfair stereotypes aimed at that. But when you look for a game like this in particular, the first place that you look is probably not the Chinese game development scene. You'd expect this maybe to come from a little European studio, but no, it doesn't. And this is a game that I think is absolutely worthy of your attention. It's already attracted quite the cult following. It's got a lot of positive feedback on Steam. It has been recognized both in China as a great indie game. It's been nominated for the Taipei Game Show in 2016, and in the West as well, by the Indie Arena booth, by Indie Play, by the Independent Games Festival. Don't be put off by this aspect of the meta-narrative, the narrative focus, because it really isn't a narrative focus. It is something that ties into the gameplay beautifully, and it is something that will encourage you to take actions that will hopefully have very satisfying results for you. Even when dealing with places that you're not supposed to go, the game doesn't just give you a narrative reward for doing that. It doesn't just give you a witty little one-liner or a hey, 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 you shouldn't have done that. More often than not, those areas will provide rewards as well. And the reason that I think that that is so important is that it fundamentally demonstrates that the first priority of the developer was to make a fun and rewarding game. It was not to impress you with just how smart he was. It was not to drown you in his own narrative. And I think we've had a few games that have tried to do that, and they've ended up coming off as both pretentious, but perhaps far more importantly than that, they have failed to make a compelling video game. They have created something which doesn't fit with the media, that doesn't take advantage of this form of media. Some people disagree with me on that and think that those particular games should indeed be called video games and are perfectly valid in their own right, and I personally do not agree. I think you have to have some basic elements to create a game, but more importantly than that, if you want to make one that's good, you've got to include a hell of a lot more than that. The great thing about a game like ICEY is that it is first and foremost a really damn enjoyable and compelling game. No, games don't have to be fun. Said it time and time again, but they do have to be compelling. Just like a movie doesn't have to be fun or funny or action-packed. No, it has to be compelling in some way. ICEY is both compelling and mechanically sublime. That is a very rare combination. That shows some serious design chops, and that is what, as far as I'm concerned, makes ICEY worthy of your $10 attention. If you are looking for a side-scrolling brawler, if you don't mind the sort of anime-style design of the main character, if you're looking for a game where you can kick some ass, and yet it's also going to make you rack your brain, it's going to make you smile, it's going to give you that little wry grin that pops up when you think you've outsmarted the designer, and then you suddenly realize that the designer is playing four-dimensional chess with you while you're just playing a damn game of Uno. This is the game for you. This is something that I think will be very, very interesting to you indeed. A memorable experience. And of course, one that is going to give different results to different people. It's going to give different endings and different voice lines in different areas and narrative elements to different people. So it has replayability, but it also has something that's going to inspire conversation. That's very, very special. We don't see games like that come along all that often, and I would strongly urge you, if you've skipped over ICEY believing that it's just another side-scroller or just another anime brawler, it's not. It's something far, 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 far more than that. And yet, even if you do take it as merely, quote-unquote, one of those things, it's one of the best in genre regardless. ICEY, ladies and gentlemen, available for $10.99 or your regional equivalent on Steam. My name has been TotalBiscuit. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, by all means, do feel free to click the like button. If not, the dislike button is right over there. And as I mentioned, after the end screen here, I'm going to include a little minor spoilery section of the game, which I found in a secret quote-unquote area. I don't really know how secret it was, but that's kind of the point, isn't it? It almost feels like I was led there by the designer, even though he was feigning that he didn't want me to go there. It's so cool to discover that. I mean, that's a true secret in an industry where we just don't really have all that many of those anymore. I'll see you next time.
有点纰漏嘛，也很正常。比如像没有上色啦，没有上色啦，没有上色啦。你别拿那种眼神看着我，我知道你在想些什么。说实话，做游戏真的很难，真的很容易出问题。你等一下，我知道你肯定不相信，我给你看下证据。欢迎来到历史之间，我之前所有的原型都在这儿。要做一款优秀的游戏，首先最重要的就是要保证游戏的原型好玩。所以我的前10年都在做原型的迭代，你知道吗？整整10年。那么首先，让你看看我的第一个迭代原型吧。这是一个很早期的版本，你能够使用变成枪的长柄武器进行近距离和远距离的攻击。但是后来我发现一个问题，谁会喜欢这样一把奇葩的武器呢？玩家一定不会喜欢它，一定。所以我把它砍了，而这个原型也被我彻底抛弃。然后让我们来看看第2段，这是第2个版本，它的特征是能够像恶魔那样吸收敌人的能力化为己用。但是后来我发现另一个问题，那就是这样做的成本实在太高了。你看，你也不希望我游戏做到一半就破产，是不是？毕竟做游戏还是要赚钱的嘛。所以我也砍了这个版本。就这样，不知不觉10年过去了。所以你看，我这么努力，有点错误或者有问题的地方，也很正常的嘛。你要理解我，要体谅我。你看，我为了把它做得好玩，我都瘦了这么多了。你看我这么努力的份上，看在我花了10年的青春的份上，是不是可以考虑啊，带评分啊？给我打个5星好评什么的。就像这样。毕竟，谁会关注这些深层次的东西呢？游戏不就是，哦哟，画面不错哦，买；哦哟，制作人很有名哦，买；哦哟，评价很多哦，买。就像个支付机器一样。然而，你买来真的会玩吗？游戏嘛，娱乐就好喽，何必那么认真去想其中的价值？稍微偷工减料一点也没什么。土豆服务器怎么样？还不是照样买。bug 多怎么样？还不是照样买。所以哥们儿，要不要喜加1？